Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 29th of April 2024. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Pause the video. Just before we start, Russia have been up to their usual business of just horrific actions. They've been chucking missiles into Odessa, hitting, I think, the Law Academy here, University Law Academy. People walking dogs. I've seen dead dogs and dead people. It's horrific. Beautiful looking building there, taken out by needless Russian missile attacks. At least 4 people killed, 28 injured, including 2 children, 16 and 5, and 1 pregnant woman. The need for patriots is really critical. And I've got to the stage tonight where I'm just like, the Russians are just bastards. I'm just so at the end of my tether, really, with finding everything about what the Russian government is doing is absolutely despicable. And I've got to another point where just anyone that even remotely tries to morally justify what the Russians are doing, it needs to take a long, hard look at their own moral compass and look in the mirror, because if you try and justify this, you're just a moral monster, and I've got absolutely no time for you. It frustrates me as well. As Finnair have just said they've got to redirect their planes. They can't fly planes around the Baltics because of the lack of GPS due to GPS jamming from Kaliningrad. What the hell are we doing? We just allow Russia to comport themselves like with impunity. It just, oh my goodness, it really frustrates me at the moment. So I'm in one of those moods this evening. I've just had enough of what these people are allowed to get away with, what the Kremlin's allowed to get away with. I think it's just absolutely despicable. My goodness. Oh yeah, I will stop ranting. Okay, let's go to the front line. Before we start on the northeastern axis, it's worth realizing that 4 battalions of Chechens have arrived in the Sumy, or near the Sumy border, which is probably the Kursk Oblast here. Could be the Belgorod Oblast, but about 150, 200 kilometers from there. I don't know whether the Russians are really sort of amassing troops for some kind of major offensive from the north. I doubt they've got the ability to do that. It could be just trying to redirect the attention of the Ukrainians by placing troops up there that might just be training or whatnot. Anyway, when we come to the northeastern axis, we have Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea. We can see that there are quite a lot of pins on the map in general. The blue ones are, I think, largely rejigs. There's been some really extensive Russian gains around the Ocheratina area in that northern part of the Avdiivka salient, but we'll get to that. For the time being, we'll go to this area where there had been quite a lot of stability over the last few months, really. Last month particularly, the Russians have been trying an awful lot around Sinkivka. That seems to stabilise. But the last couple of days, there's been activity around Kislivka. Still activity there today, although no changes to the mapping. But then further to the south here, at on the way to Pischane from the Krokmalna direction, the Russians appear to have made some gains according to Suryat maps. If we look at the 3D rendering of what's going on here, you have a low, sort of very gradual valley there that Pischane sits in, and the Russians look to be making gains up the valley, but also might be trying to get on this higher ground to the north and the higher ground to the south here, so that they could get fire control over the village of Pischane by looking down on it. I don't know whether they have enough to make a large advance here, or whether that is just a very localized, or whether it's actually happened at all. I mean, this is only one mapper saying it, but it could just be a localized bit of opportunism going on there. But there is activity to the north. It does look like there is something a little more going on there than we've seen previously. Then when we come to the, by the way, Surat map says of that clashes between the two armies continue in the western part of Kislivka and the outskirts of Kotaliriivka. Meanwhile, Russian forces began advancing south of Tabaivka in the direction of Pischane, as just seen, taking control over a series of positions in the lower ground. And then when we come further to the south in the Torska Terny salient here, the Russians have been pushed back, it seems, a little to the east of Yampolivka in the forest areas there. Really good news that the Ukrainians are pushing back a little bit, at least in some places. Here, Surat Map says, during the last 10 days, the Ukrainian army managed to recapture more ground in the Blizhny Dalny forest areas east of Yampolivka. So good news. Although, well, yeah, that is a little bit further than the other mappers have it there. So it's not just a case of a rejig there. It looks like the Ukrainians might have pushed back. And when we come further to the south, we pass the Serebyansky forest, which is as ever active. Bilahorivka, where the Ukrainians have had a little bit of success, or at least a further forward than we had previously thought. And then we come to Chaziv Yar to the west of Bakhmut here. And this is an interesting one we'll come to in a minute, the Canal Microdistrict. If we look at Bodanivka, you can see Andrew Perpetua has the Russians pushing forward quite a bit, taking control of the whole of Bodanivka. I don't know whether that is in the last 24 hours or just evidence that then confirms what Deep State Map had previously said and what Surat Maps had kind of half said. But yeah, the Russians may have made some ground there in the last 24 hours too. Who knows? It's going to be pretty dynamic. This is interesting because this could well be a rejig rather than the Ukrainians pushing the Russians out of the initial outskirts of Chaziv Yar. Some people say this isn't Chaziv Yar, that Chaziv Yar is only the other side of the canal here. This is the Canal Microdistrict. But either way, I mean, semantics. The Russians were here, according to Surat Maps, and then aren't anymore. And I just think that's probably a bit of a rejig where they've mapped overzealously. Russians may have just attacked in there and then got repelled on the same day. But it's like, they're there. They've been there. They control it. But actually, they don't. So, yeah, interesting. They've mapped that back, and actually that's something's happened somewhere else that you'll understand what I mean by finally when we get down there soon. Right, we're going to come down past Klishchivka, Kurdyamivka, where there's no change, past the Toretsk, New York area. There are some ideas that actually Andrew Perpetua was talking about this on a Tochny live stream last night, where the Russians pushing north here from the northern part of Avdiivka, and again I think this is probably opportunism rather than something they had previously planned. I mean, the objective appears to be Pokrovsk. That would be your large strategic or operational objective there, because of you look at the hub that is in terms of all the roads and no doubt railway as well, and that will be your staging point for I think a lot of the front line around here. Well, rather than using their success at the moment around this northern part of Avdiivka to make for Pokrovsk, it's likely that they're going to be heading for this road here, which is a key road connecting Konstantinivka to the north here on that semicircle of settlements, Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, and Toretsk and New York down here. This road is obviously a key road, and if they can compromise that road then and interdict it, that will cause the Ukrainians all sorts of trouble. And it could be that could be the Russian objective now, that they're all like, we've got through here, we've had success. If we keep pushing, then that would be a great achievement. So as you can see here, quite a lot going on. It's very busy in terms of pins. I did a mapping today, and I'll tell you what, it's like I was wearing a thimble, because this is a right pin cushion. Okay, we have, first of all, Andrew Perpetua agreeing that there are substantial gains in the Novaya Konyovo area, kind of putting him in line with Surat Maps, and then a little bit further actually to that northern part of Keramik. So it looks like Keramik is now mostly under control of the Russians. We have Surat Maps and Andrew Perpetua. I mean, this is the most substantial area of gain. It looks like the Ukrainians have really pulled out of, because they were sort of getting surrounded there south of Novaya Konyovo, as the Russians were pushing up from Ocheratina there and then into Keramik. This is obviously not a nice place for the Ukrainians to be, particularly in that area. So it looks like they pulled out, and the Russians have now got control over quite a large amount of ground compared to the day before. If we look at how far that is across, that is sort of well, if we go to Andrew Perpetua's line, that would be almost 5 kilometers across there, a few kilometers deep. So that's some serious gains for the Russians. There is some rejigging, I think. So I doubt that the Ukrainians have pushed back here. It's probably that Surat Maps had mapped that under Russian control and then has seen evidence that the Ukrainians are either there or there's shelling going on or whatever. Russian shelling taking place there. On the other hand, Andrew Perpetua has the Russians gaining some more, that last kind of part of Ocheratina before you get to this kind of northern bit here that Surat Maps interestingly has the Russians controlling. None of the other mappers have that. It's obviously going to be very dynamic around here. And then you have the Russians really pushing out, all the mappers agreeing there's at least some gains for the Russians along this road to the north and in the direction of that main road I was talking about over there. So this is worrying that they are able to push through the Ukrainian lines. I presume there's going to be some larger Ukrainian defenses somewhere around here. I don't know the mapping of the Ukrainian defenses in this area. But I would imagine that they're going to sit to the to the east of that main road rather than behind it. So I expect the Russians to come up against some serious fortifications and opposition around here. Right, then as we come a little bit further south of Ocheratina, we have some rejigs here for Andrew Perpetua, just a tiny bit. I doubt it's any kind of counterattack by the Ukrainians, but he seems to think that the Russians are actually further back there, sort of similar to Deep State Map, whereas Surat Maps has the Russians further to the west, and then further to the south here around Solovyove, that the Russians have made some gains according to Andrew Perpetua, and that's quite significant gains around there compared to what the other mappers are saying. I say quite significant. I mean, it's one field and a tree line, but yeah, just over half a kilometer's width there. But still, you know, it piles on the pressure for the Ukrainians around here, who I think are probably in a bit of dire straits, considering they need boots on the ground and they need all that artillery, ammunition, and other equipment to get to the front lines toot sweet. This stuff takes time. So they're not going to be feeling it yet. I just hope that they can use up extensive or any reserves they might have. It's not extensive. Use up any reserves they have in terms of artillery ammunition and just staunch the flow here. So the Russians are at least somewhat halted in their fairly quick advancing in this area. Then when we come further to the south, we have some more gains for the Russians, as according to all the mappers around the Pervomaisky area and north of Pervomaisky, pushing on further into Netayolove, which is worrying for the Ukrainians, as we can see all the mappers having the Russians in that part of the settlement. Andrew Perpetua having the largest gains for the Russians there, seeing enough evidence to say, yep, they are over there, which is where Surat Maps had already had them mainly. Surat Maps has just added this part on today. So that was one area where Surat Maps was seemingly correct. We've got probably some rejigging here rather than the Ukrainians pushing back. Like I said before, there's a high probability that the Russians do not control any of that area, and it's probably grey zone. Surat Maps has that tendency to make those big, bold claims. And then here is the big one, Novelsky, that I was going to tell you about before. Like Andrew Perpetua said weeks and weeks ago, they absolutely categorically do not control Novelsky, the Russians, and yet Surat Maps had that taken one day, and it's like there is evidence that the Ukrainians are there, they don't control it, and it just sometimes it takes weeks and weeks before Surat Maps goes, okay, yeah, no, they don't control that. So we'll have a look at some of the things they say here. Yeah, this is the one. That the situation northwest of Donetsk during the last few days, the Russian army took control over 30% of the locality of Netayolove. On the other hand, some modifications were made at Novelsky, as the warehouses and parts of the buildings remains under grey zone. So there you go. So walking it back there with some modifications. Less said about that, the better. Now, it doesn't seem that, although there's extensive mapping changes to to Surat maps, it's not featuring on their tweets at the moment. So I'd expect some tweets to come out to indicate what's been going on up here. I don't have any at the moment. I expect that to, as I say, to come out. They're just this little one there. They have here, what's it? The Russian army continue increasing the buffer zone around Ochiret. Oh no, actually that's further up here, to be honest, in this area, just there. That's that one they have, but not got any of the other ones tweeted about, but I'm sure that'll happen. So there you go. All of those pins just give you an indication that there is a lot going on in that area just now. So let's move further down to the last pins on the map, and these are around Novomykhailivka, predominantly to the north for Andrew Perpetua, and then to the south for Surat maps. All the mappers agree that the main part of Novomykhailivka is under Russian control. Deep State Maps hasn't quite caught on with that northern part there. Here we have the trees and fields, tree lines and fields to the north of the town becoming increasingly under control of the Russians. They're equalizing that front line, sort of trying to join it up to Pobieda there. There previously was, quite a lot of decent Ukrainian defense around here, but it's difficult to hold on to when north and south the Russians are gaining. And then Surat maps, as mentioned, showing some Russian gains to the southwest of Novomykhailivka, just pushing further forward on the way to Konstantinivka, which is a bit of a worry. If they get to there, then that really interdicts this road connecting Vuhledar to the rest. And yeah, it's not looking too good for the Ukrainians on this whole eastern front at the moment, where the Russians are really piling on. But as I said, yes, I'll say it again, for those newbies, 50% of the people watching this will be newbies. I'm not sure the Russians have all that much in the tank. I think they are throwing everything they possibly can at these points on the front line in order to take advantage of the fact that the Ukrainians are low on manpower and low on equipment and ammunition. So this is the absolute optimal time, possibly the optimal time for the next year for the Russians to attack. And I'd be really surprised, as I mentioned earlier today, there are some claims that the Russians are stockpiling equipment in the Ternitorska, maybe Luhansk area. There's possible amassing of equipment north of the border, talking about like mechanized equipment here. I think that would be insane for the Russians to do that. If I was a Russian commander and I was tasked with, at some point in the next year or two, taking as much land as possible, now's the time I'd be throwing absolutely everything. I would not be amassing any equipment anywhere. It is now, before the Ukrainians get their aid packages through, and before the Czech initiative and maybe the Estonian initiative get their artillery ammunition. Now's the time to hit the Ukrainians when they're low on manpower, low on equipment, and you can see that they're on the back foot in this Avdiivka area. They're on the back foot in the Pervomaisky area, and indeed Krasnohorivka and Novomykhailivka. I'd just be concentrating on here. I'd be drawing troops away from certain areas to pull them into these regions, especially if you think the Russians are going to be thinking about May the 9th Victory Day. If they want to shout about stuff which is only sort of just under 2 weeks away, if they want to be shouting about big victories, then I'd be piling it into those places and getting aviation before air defenses get there in any meaningful numbers. They want to be absolutely hammering these places even more with guided glide bombs, which they're doing anyway, right? But I'd just be piling everything in that I could. So I don't know. Let me know what you think of my rationale today, and what do you think that says about the Russian capabilities and capacities at the moment in terms of troop numbers and equipment numbers. Anyway, no change to the southern front line, no change to the Dnipro area either. There is only this to be said, which we knew yesterday. This is basically coming from General Sursky, where he said that island of Nistrea has been the control of that island is now with the Ukrainians. So that's just here. It doesn't show up on the map because these are Russian defensive lines, but Ukrainians, according to now Surrey maps as well, are in control of that island. You would imagine they'll be trying to take control over all of these bit by bit to give them that edge in the area, but it is difficult around there. Boats are very easy to target, I think, with drones. Very active for both sides of drones around that area, and that's why we see so many boats getting sunk on the daily loss lists from Andrew Perpetua, particularly Ukrainian boats. So there you go. That's today's Frontline update for you. Really hope you found that informative. Take care, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.